Okay, so I recorded a brief lecture on the Progressive Era and have been struggling with getting it uploaded because I was at my house. So I'll get that uploaded as soon as I can. But for now, let's move forward and get to talking about World War I, the spread of democracy, and so on and so forth. So, World War I from 1914 to 1918. Although we will discuss World War I in brief detail, it was rather significant. Most Europeans see World War I as being much more significant than World War II. Americans tend to look at World War II probably because we had more participation and experienced fighting on our own soil, things of that nature. So with World War I, ultimately we have a combination of things. Nationalism being key to the start of World War I, or one of the keys. And we see an alliance system that has built up between the major powers over in Europe, Germany, France, Russia, England. All of those different places have alliances, and then backdoor alliances with others, so that when basically when Germany declares war, everyone else is drug into it in just a matter of weeks, really. Some could say days even. It's just a horrible situation that came about. Germany, as the instigator, Germany has a plan for fighting a two-front war, which is something that they did not want, but wound up happening. So Germany's plan is the Schlieffen Plan, and the idea was that they would have time to battle Russia, because Russia's a really big place. It would take a long time to mobilize all of their troops. Therefore, they should focus most of their fighting initially in France. That way they could take France out quickly and then turn to focus on Russia. However, at the Battle of the Marne against the French, it lasted 7 days. To begin with, it looked like the Germans would be victorious. However, the Allies were quickly reinforced and eventually able to halt the tide of the Germans, not push back or rout, but definitely to halt them, giving a major victory to France and France's allies. So, but that means that Germany is then left with a two-front war, and as I mentioned, they were halted. They were not routed. They weren't turned around. So we see with World War I, we see it being marked by trench warfare. The land in between the trenches was referred to as no man's land. As you can see from the images, these are barren lands. There's some trees sort of off in the distance, also lots of smoke in the distance. But as armies were digging these trenches, you have to imagine there's brand new artillery that's being used, new weapons of war. Although tanks don't really show up or really be effective towards the end, airplanes are utilized, bombs, and all of this is going to wreak havoc on the landscape in Europe. So it becomes very dangerous to get out of your trench, therefore taking Europe into stalemate mode, particularly on the Western Front. The U.S. enters the war in 1917. President Wilson, to begin with, says, okay, the U.S. is not going to get involved. We are going to be neutral in thought and deed. Of course, you might turn a blind eye if we're going to send aid to different places, you know, and not to others. But, you know, as an official stance, we are going to be neutral, both in thought and in deed. But in 1915, there was a passenger liner called the Lusitania, which carried over 100 Americans. Now, it has been discovered that the Lusitania was in fact carrying supplies for the the Allied military war machine. And this was a common, well, I'd say a common practice. It was a practice sort of adopted because who would suspect a passenger liner as being a basically a ship of war? Well, the German submarines sank the Lusitania. Teddy Roosevelt was quoted as saying that this was an act of piracy and that we needed to enter into the war. But we see public opinion definitely divided on whether or not we should enter the war. You have some who are saying that that those are Americans, and because they are Americans, we should enter the war and we should avenge those Americans who were killed, and then also look at what's going on in Europe. And then you have others who are saying, well, no, this is really not our fight. But in 1917, we see the Germans contacting Mexico and saying that Mexico could have U.S. territory if they were to fire on the United States, ultimately giving Germany an opportunity for victory if the U.S. were to enter the war, known as the Zimmerman Note. Woodrow Wilson and Congress used this as the means necessary to enter the war, so they declare war on Germany in April of 1917. Still with not an overabundance of support, but people are willing to move forward and support the U.S. in this war. On the home front, we see a mobilization not only of soldiers but of civilians. We have to not just produce people who can fight, but there has to be food, there has to be weaponry and armor, machinery that can go into battle as well. There needs to be pencil pushers, right? There's got to be people who can do the filing. There needs to be medics, all sorts of things. And also money. You have to be able to pay your troops, or else troops won't, after a while, necessarily want to continue fighting. We see, to mobilize the home front, the introduction of a fairly intense propaganda campaign. You can see the images there. There's one image of this beautiful, fresh-faced young woman. Help us help our boys. YMCA, YWCA. And the look on her face, this one just kind of cracks me up, because she's looking back like, I'm helping. What are you doing? I'm putting up a poster. I don't know. I might be reading that completely wrong, but that's what it seems like to me. So, help us help our boys. I'm doing something, you should be doing something too. It speaks to women, but it also speaks to men, because here's this young woman who's at least doing something. And what about you, man? What are you doing? The one on the bottom, this one really, this can speak to both women and men as well, but this one is probably going to be the one you'll find in the men's bathroom, right? Destroy this mad brute. You have the sort of King Kong-like figure there in the middle. He's wearing a German helmet, and so in this piece of propaganda, well, in most pieces of propaganda, you see the Germans as reduced to subhuman-like status. He is definitely a brute. He's carrying a club saying culture. So the culture of the Germans is one of brute force, not of art, not of music, not even cuisine, right, or architecture. It is one where they go and take what they want through violent means. In his arms, he's holding a woman whose dress has been torn. She's bare-chested. This is pretty intense. So if he hasn't raped her, maybe he's going to. So in many ways, this poster is looking at all of those guys who have not enlisted and is saying, look, this could be your wife. This could be your family. Why have you not enlisted? So again, pretty intense. The final battles come in 1918 and the Great War finally ends, but the devastation left was just intense. This is the first time we really see heavy industrialized warfare with industrialized war machines. Somewhere around about 7 to 10 million soldiers and 7 to 10 million civilians have been killed during this conflict. But then what about those left behind? We see a number of amputees, men suffering from shell shock or like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or suffering from other types of war trauma. And this sort of wreaks havoc on the mind, and many soldiers and civilians, because of what they experienced during the war, were unable to lead a life similar to what they had. It was not uncommon to walk down the street and to see people with missing limbs. Not uncommon in Europe, especially, to walk down the street and to, for there to only be a street where once there was a neighborhood. So, this is just a horrible situation that involved, it's World War I, so it involves the world. I mean, there's very few people in the world who were not touched by this. Just a really horrifying situation. And although the Americans and the Japanese sort of came out on top, they're the only ones who really come out on top during this time. Excuse me. The Americans and the Japanese are just as fearful of seeing something like this happening again. So in January of 1919, the different countries involved get together at Versailles. However, it is Britain, France, and the U.S. which are making all the major decisions, and they're leaving some people out completely, like Russia. Russia left the war before it was over because of a revolution and civil war which took place and wound up lasting until 1920, giving rise to the Bolsheviks, or the communists, in the Russian government. So Russia's completely left out, the Japanese are completely left out, and a few others are completely left out, and this is obviously going to cause some tension later on down the road, right? Spoiler alert. The French in particular want a hard peace. They want Germany to pay, and they don't just want money. Like, they want to completely humiliate and flatline Germany. Mostly because the French are the ones who have experienced the worst atrocities at the hands of the Germans than any others. More people have died there. Just a lot of really bad things. So the French don't want to have any mercy whatsoever on the Germans. But President Wilson comes in, meaning, intending to be the mediator, the voice of reason, and he says that we need to have a just peace, because although Germany was wrong, yada yada, these people are still going to be our neighbors. We can't go in and just kill them all off or anything like that. These are still people. They're still going to be your neighbors. We need to be able to work with them, and we need to rebuild, recover and rebuild. So hashing out all of the peace terms ultimately took 6 months. The end result is that Germany and Germany's allies took full responsibility for the war, and France got a little bit more of what it wanted in terms of issuing that humiliation and flatlining Germany, because this is something that will bear its teeth later on, is the humiliation of Germany. Wilson advocates the introduction or the creation of the League of Nations. And interestingly enough, Congress was like, no, we're not going to be a part of that. We didn't agree to that. What are you doing, President? And so the guy who created the League of Nations, his country ultimately was not allowed to join the League of Nations, which was not really a military alliance. Think kind of like the United Nations. It's a place to come together and to resolve issues sort of diplomatically. John Maynard Keynes, who we'll talk about more in more detail in just a few moments, said about the peace treaty that the treaty includes no provision for the economic rehabilitation of Europe. Nothing to make the defeated Central Powers into good neighbors. Nothing to stabilize the new states of Europe. Nothing to reclaim Russia. So Keynes, although not my favorite economist of the 20th century, he's rather prophetic in this statement. And it's a long, hard road that everyone has to go down before they see it. So we have the Roaring Twenties for the United States after this period of time where life is looking pretty good, and you know, we've got jazz, we've got flappers, we've got new rights for women, and America is like the leading power because guess what? No fighting took place on our soil. So life is grand for Americans. Everyone else, they're kind of looking to America to help them out with everything, ultimately, once again, because America wasn't overly involved. So, Europe. For Europe, once again, Europe has suffered so very much. Here we go. Europe has suffered so very much that money is very hard to come by. So the U.S. becomes like an international bank and loan. They loan money to nearly every major country, and the hope is that, you know, eventually they would pay it back. In Germany, there is a revolution in which Kaiser Wilhelm abdicates the throne, and we have the introduction of the Weimar Republic. In the Weimar Republic, this was an attempt at a democratic form of government, but the inflation is so bad. You can see in the image to the right there that you have children playing with stacks of money. That's what that is. Those are stacks of money, and they're playing with it like it's nothing. There are stories of people needing a wheelbarrow full of money in order to buy milk or bread. So this is pretty intense. Germany is not in a good place. In 1923, it defaults on its loan, basically making it unable to pay its reparation payments to France or to Belgium. Therefore, the French in particular are like, all right, fine, we're going to go take care of this. And they send troops into the Rhineland. The Rhineland was the most industrialized place in Germany, and probably the one place in Germany that could really help them get out of their economic woes. But the French came in expecting to take it over, and they were like, all right, fine, well, if you're not going to pay us, we're going to take the place that could, you know, bring you the most success, and we're going to take it for ourselves. Well, this kind of freaks everybody out a little bit. Germany's not allowed to have a standing army. They're not really allowed to have weapons and stuff like that. So, you know, there's a lot of like, oh snap, what's going on? We cannot enter into another war. And you need to remember that, especially. That is something that everybody is thinking about. We cannot enter into another war. So we see a guy coming from the U.S. with the name of Dawes. Charles Dawes. Oh dear, I hope I got his name right. I'm pretty sure it's Charles. Anyway, Mr. Dawes comes in 1923, and he has a plan. then of course named for him, because why wouldn't you name your own plan after you? This makes sense. So we have the Dawes Plan, which offers Germany new loans to help Germany make its reparation payments and to avoid any sort of conflict with any other nation. And also he offers France a new payment plan in which he says, okay, look, you know, you kind of have to chill out a little bit. So yeah, just take a chill pill. And in 1926, you know, it's been around about 3 years, Germany has made fairly good progress. We do start to see a glimpse of prosperity in all of Europe, not just in Germany. And people are starting to feel okay. And so in 1926, Germany was admitted to the League of Nations. Now, in the USA, after World War I, once again, we enter into a period of time of the Roaring Twenties. What exactly are we roaring to, though? That's sort of my question that I ask. In the U.S., there's trouble brewing. In industry, production is up, but Europeans and others can't buy anything. Really, the only other country that could afford to buy all the different new gadgets and doodads that the Americans are producing are the Japanese and, of course, other Americans. But the Europeans, probably the one place where they have the biggest market, not going to happen. And agriculture. Of course, agriculture in the United States is going to boom during the war because in Europe, soldiers and others needed food. And those guys are, you know, they were once farmers. Also, think about all of those trenches. There's so much land that was that literally became a battlefield. So of course, agriculture in the U.S. is going to be up. However, after the war, Europeans began farming again. Farmers in the U.S. saw big declines in the prices, and they didn't realize that this was a normalizing process taking place, because once again, for so long, their prices had been up. You know, oh no, what happened? So they, with big declines, we see farmers trying to plant more, trying to raise more, trying to produce more, which is just really not the best idea. Then price decline coupled with natural disasters, floods, storms, droughts, all sorts of things, which destroyed livestock and crops, created further farming problems, which ultimately weakened the banking system. Farmers in the U.S. would go and they would get their money that they would need to plant their crops and take care of the land and so on and so forth. And then basically, as soon as they were able to pay that off, they had to get another loan in order to basically start the process all over again. Well, what happens when you can't pay that back? So the banking system is greatly weakened. And then in corporations, in the business sector, again, there's a boom in the 20s, which raises stock prices, causing more investment. Some overspeculation begins to take place, although not the sole cause for the stock market crash. It is one of sort of three major causes that I have listed here for you. More investment, overspeculation, not necessarily a good thing. Then in October of 1929, the New York stock market crashes. Again, let's go back over what's going on. Okay, so the causes of economic collapse. The U.S., again, loaned out quite a bit of money. And in 1928, they started to ask for it back because they were like, things are starting to look a little bleak on the horizon. People are seeing that trouble is brewing, right? The farmers are experiencing trouble and people aren't buying things. Oh dear, what do we do? So they start to ask for their money back, but of course, people can't pay. I mean, if you're borrowing money to pay someone else, how are you going to have enough money to pay back the person who loaned you money? It just doesn't make sense, right? Then comes Black Tuesday on October 29th, 1929. Not to be confused with the awesome sales coming on this Black Friday. Black Tuesday, black being sort of indicative of mourning attire, right? Like a death, a funeral. Stocks lost almost 2/3 of their value, causing banks and businesses to fail. When banks and businesses fail, people either can't get their money or no longer have the opportunity to make money. Therefore, we see lots of foreclosures, and there really is depression in every sense of the word. Here we are back again with John Maynard Keynes. There were two leading economists from Europe during this time. Excuse me as I take some water. John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek. So, Keynes was a British economist, and his bottom line, and ultimately this guy, he was an academic. He found himself in fantastic academic circles who promoted him and pushed him and put his articles in journals and all this kind of stuff, giving him acclaim. With him, it was a whole lot about who he knew. But his bottom line, the bottom line to his theory really is, when no one else is spending, the government should. From the New York Times, I found this pretty interesting article in which the author stated, there was only one sure way to get an increase in spending in the face of an extreme private sector reluctance to spend, and that was for the government to spend the money itself. But that spending by the government should be aimed at public works in order to speed up growth to its previous levels. So, when no one else is spending, the government should. That would be John Maynard Keynes. Friedrich Hayek, however, I tend to agree more so with him. Hayek was an Austrian by birth, and he actually fought for the Austrians during World War I, who helped Germany start the war, right? During World War I, his experiences led him to pursue an academic career in order to help governments avoid mistakes that could lead to a similar war. He was from a long line of nobility, which, of course, had lost its title, and he came from a long line of very intelligent people. So, after his experiences in the war, I think he probably took a realistic look at his life and what he was capable of. And he said, okay, I'm an academic. So he goes into academics and becomes highly educated in several different areas, economics being only one part. He argued that private investments in public markets would produce better results than government spending programs. However, the government did have a role to play in the economy, but it was not in overspending in order to inflate the economy. So his bottom line was, the government should protect the people, but not throw money at them when they make poor financial choices, because this will only continue the problems. So if a man, let's say Mr. Goodyear, right, who owns, I don't know who owns Goodyear's tires, but let's just say that there's a dude by the name of Goodyear who has created Goodyear tires, and in the 20s, he had just excellent business because everybody had money to afford vehicles. And they weren't just automobiles. There were, let's say, tractors and other vehicles like that needed tires. And so he had an excellent couple of years. And so instead of just ordering the same amount, after let's say 2 to 3 years, he decides he needs to order double so that his warehouse will be full. And that way, when people come in to buy things, they won't be tempted to go to a competitor if he is out of stock. So he does this, but he does it for a few more years, and then the stock market crashes. He continues to have tires made, and he builds up his supply in his warehouse. However, 1934, let's say, by this time, it's obvious that the Depression is not going anywhere, right? We're all just sort of sitting back. We're all just kind of sitting back, hanging tight, trying to see what's going to happen. Mr. Goodyear's losing money, hand over fist. He's finally stopped issuing orders to make tires, but he's got like 2 to 3 warehouses full. So what should happen? Should the government buy all of those tires in order to help Mr. Goodyear? Or should Mr. Goodyear cut his losses? Keep the tires for as long as they are good to use and sell them as they are needed? What should he do? What would be the best financial decision? Or we could go back to the farmers. The farmers who have been continuing to plow and to herd and to, continuously raise crops and livestock with prices continuing to fall. Should they continue to get loans that they're not able to pay back? This is the big question. So, Friedrich Hayek says the government still has a role to play, but not in overspending in order to inflate the economy. It's funny money, right? So, to end this part of the lecture, there is a super fun video that I think you will really enjoy. This is a video that I found. Oh, I can't even see. This is a video that I found on YouTube, and I will put the link up for you. This is the Fear the Boom and Bust rap featuring Hayek and Keynes. Of course, not the real people because they're dead. hope you enjoyed that.